Grab your Bible and either the one you brought with you or the one in front of you and turn with me to the passage that Joel read at the beginning of the service as we were kind of getting our hearts and our minds focused on what we are here to do and who we are here to focus on. And just to kind of set up where we're at in the whole process of our current series is that we've been focusing this Christmas season on the gift that we need, the best gift ever given to anyone, the gift of God's Son, Jesus. And so as we've been kind of getting focused on that, we've been looking at a prophecy or a promise given in the Old Testament. So we've been looking at this promise in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, that tells us a little bit about this gift that God was sending into the world, or this gift who God was sending into the world, a gift that would be sent 730, or this promise was given 730 years before the arrival of Jesus, a gift that would eventually come, but a promise that was made to people in the midst of a pretty hopeless circumstances, and yet good news for us too, as we wrestle with the life that we have around us and the things that are going on, a promise given to us in the midst of our own hopeless sorts of circumstances that maybe you're dealing with this Christmas season. That as Isaiah pens these words, as the Holy Spirit guides him, as God's breath guides the pen of Isaiah, he writes these words that tell us, and his name, this is Jesus, shall be called, or will be called, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. In this particular promise, there are these four names ascribed to Jesus that tell us a little bit about his character and his capability. They describe how he relates to us. They describe who God would become to them and who he would become to us. And so these last 4 weeks, or I guess 3 weeks, including today, we've been looking at each one of these names, talking about what we learn of Jesus. Then each week, not just taking a look at the name in Isaiah chapter 9, but looking in the New Testament, and particularly in one of the four Gospels that describes the life and the work of Jesus. We've been looking at how Jesus brings this particular character quality to life, how he demonstrates it. And so this week we're focusing on Jesus as that everlasting Father. Now, this is, I think, the most relational name that's given to Jesus out of the four that are given to Jesus in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. He's the everlasting Father. I realize that when we hear the word Father, and when we hear the word Father ascribed to God, either as God the Father or Jesus as the everlasting Father, demonstrating the heart of his Father, that brings up all kinds of images and emotions in our hearts. That it is very easy for us to project onto God sort of the image that we have of our earthly Father. And that can be a good thing or it can be a not good thing. And I want to talk about that a little bit before we enter into the specifics of talking about Jesus as the everlasting Father. Because some of you are here, and when you hear Jesus described as the everlasting Father, your image of your earthly father it's just a good thing. When you think about your father, it brings images of compassion or love or closeness, images of maybe commitment, maybe how he provided for you or he cared for you. When you think about your earthly father, they are warm, fuzzy feelings because your interactions with, your experiences with, your memories of your dad are special and they're cherished. Now, there's a whole other group of you who are here. And dare I say, having experienced what I've experienced in hearing about your experiences, is that the other group of you is probably the larger group. A group of people who, when you hear Jesus described as Father, and when you think about your experiences with and memories of your earthly father, it's not warm and it's not fuzzy and it's not all that good. That when you think about the word Father, it's associated with perhaps leaving. Or you think about the word Father, it's associated with anger. Or you think about the word Father, it's associated with silence or distance or broken promises. Maybe it's even worse than any of those particular images that come to mind. And maybe when you even saw that we were discussing the topic of Jesus being the everlasting Father, you felt, oh man, like really? Like we have to talk about this? Because people, let me say that secular psychologists and Christian counselors tend to agree on this, that our relationship with our earthly father is pretty vital. And it affects the way we see ourselves, the way we see the world around us, and the way we see God. This is why biblical counselors and a lot of secular psychologists agree on this thing called a father wound, that many people carry around this woundedness that shows up in all kinds of ways in their lives. And so I realize that when we talk about this is very personal. And I can even see on some of your faces and in some of your expressions, some of the pain, perhaps, that you're feeling even now as we talk about this, because for you, some of your greatest pain in life has come from your relationship or your lack of relationship with your Father. And when you hear about God as Father or Jesus as the everlasting Father, it doesn't conjure up some of the best feelings or images. And let me also say, for some of you as fathers, like here's where I'm at. You hear about the image of Jesus as the everlasting Father, and then I think about my own fatherhood, like my role in being that to my kids, right? And trying to prevent some of those father wounds in their lives. And I think, oh my gosh, like I don't know if I'm up to this task. Like it just feels so far off. Like how do I do this? And so let me say this as we get ready to dive into this, because again, this is the most relational name for Jesus, in my opinion, in this particular verse, okay? In this particular prophecy or promise. So let me just say that if you're here and you have warm fuzzies when you hear the word Father, this is a good message for you where we're going to go. If you're here today and you don't have very good memories of your father, maybe you never knew your father was distant or abusive or something altogether different, that I think this is a good passage for you as well. Because I think it helps you to see the heart of Jesus as the everlasting Father. And I think, too, there's a very real element in here beyond that. Like I think the best application of this passage is it describes the Father's heart. It moves us to put our hope in Jesus and experience life as it was meant to be lived. But there's another application, because I think that as we learn about the fatherhood of God and the fatherhood of God that's displayed through the everlasting Father, who is Jesus, there's a healing and a wholeness that comes to those very deep and personal father wounds that we carry. And so there's that application as well for you. And for you who are dads, and I would say even moms who don't want to repeat some of that father woundedness in the lives of those who come after you, I think there's a lot of wisdom in the passage as well. And let me, while I'm thinking of it, speak to another segment of the population, those of you who are parents, who can identify with the father in the passage that we're going to talk about in Luke chapter 15, where you have kids that you've raised in a particular direction, who've headed out from your home in a totally opposite direction. And for you, perhaps there's a sense of regret, a sense of longing, and I think there's something for you as well. So this is a passage that we're going to look at that has some very personal implications for us. That this is more than just a passage that we look at and just say kind of like, yeah, I know that, and then kind of move on. There's a lot here for us, no matter who we are, no matter where we're at. And I'd say that what we have here is good. It's going to be in Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. But before we jump into Luke chapter 15, I do want to say that in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, when Isaiah uses that word everlasting and then that word Father and links them together, that word everlasting in the original language is exactly what we think it is in the English, right? It means forever. It's eternal. And here's the good news for you. Maybe you had a father who quit on you early on or at some point in your life. Or maybe you had a father who was never around. He was completely absent. Or you had a father who died prematurely, who's just no longer in your life for that reason. This piece of the everlasting Father is so important to us because it goes beyond kind of like anything that we can experience kind of in our relationship with our earthly father, that our everlasting Father, who is Jesus, right, who displays the heart of God the Father, he never quits. He never leaves us or forsakes us. Jesus didn't stay dead in a grave. He rose again. He really is everlasting. And then that word Father is exactly what it means in the original language, that he is a relational God. He is not some distant, far off, uncaring, uninvolved deity. No, he wants to relate to us in a very real, in a very personal way that affects every part of our lives. And as we have been these last few weeks, I want to take you to a passage where Jesus demonstrates that for us. And so what does it look like for Jesus to demonstrate that he is the everlasting Father? Well, Jesus will say, and you'll read about this in the four Gospels if you would do a quick survey, that Jesus will say things like, if anyone has seen me, he has seen the Father. Or he'll say things like, I and my Father are one. So that as we think about, well, what does the everlasting Father look like? Jesus is going to display that in the way he interacts with people and in the truth that he reveals about his Father. And that's what he does in Luke chapter 15. And this is, I would say, one of my favorite passages in the entire Bible. I would also argue that this is sort of one of the flagship passages in the Bible that displays in no uncertain terms and in very vivid ways the heart of God himself. It's one of the most compelling pictures of God's love and Jesus' love and the love that the Holy Spirit gives us, probably that we can find in most any other place in the entire Bible. And what we see here is this, that when we see and experience the Father's heart, the heart of the everlasting Father, it actually changes us. That Jesus shows us what this heart looks like. Now, the passage is labeled at times the story of the prodigal son, or the story of the lost son, or better yet, the story of the lost sons, because both sons in the passage are lost. I'll talk about why that is. But I don't really think it's a story about the sons as much as it's a story about that relentless, never quitting, always faithful, that overwhelming, lavish, generous love of God as Father that he displays through his Son Jesus, who shows us everything that the Father is. So that when Jesus is promised to be the everlasting Father, for those of us who have put our hope in Jesus, look, we've experienced this deep within our souls, that this is who Jesus is, and this is what Jesus does. And so what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the passage and make some observations along the way that I think are very, very helpful. But what's most helpful is just for us to understand the context of what's happening in the passage. And so Jesus is gathered around. There's this crowd that's now gathering around Jesus. We see that at the beginning of the passage, actually the beginning of the chapter, verse 1 of chapter 15, that Jesus by now is attracting, and there are people listening to him who are kind of down and out, not the kind of people you'd expect to be seeking after Jesus kind of people. You have in the crowd tax collectors who would have in this particular day been labeled as some of the worst sinners who were out there. I'm not sure that we have any tax collectors in the crowd today, but we have plenty of sinners, right? And so we can identify plenty of sinners. We can identify with that part of the crowd, those sort of irreligious rebels who are listening in. But also in the crowd, we have these people, you'll see it there, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, who would have given their lives to the study of what God had to say and would have worked as best as they could in their human strength to live up to all of God's standards. You have these people who kind of did what God wanted, but who had kind of missed the heart of what God was after all along. They knew about God's rules, but they weren't all that acquainted with God's heart. And this is the crowd of people who is listening in to what Jesus has to say. And I would argue that every one of us is somewhere on that continuum, the religious sort of rule follower or the irreligious sort of rebel. We can see our own faces in the crowd. I was talking to somebody after the first service, and she said, I've been a Christian a while, and I've looked at this passage a lot of different times, and yet as I've lived my life and as I've had all these different experiences, I find that every time I come to this passage, I can identify with a different person's story. Like sometimes I can look back at my life, and I could have identified with the religious son who in the opposite direction. There are times when I can identify with the religious son who missed the father's heart. I can identify with the father with that longing and compassion that he wanted to demonstrate to his son, or to both sons, and yet they didn't want to receive it. And I think for you and for me, we can see ourselves in that crowd as well. that there are all these different faces, and your face and my face are just a few of those faces. But what Jesus does is he tells three different sets of stories about things that were lost. A lost sheep, a lost coin, and now a lost son. And that's where we catch up in verse 11. So if you're following with me, let's just walk through the passage together. And so he tells a story where there was a man who had two sons. He had a younger son and an older son. And the younger son goes up to his father and says, "Dad, I want you to give me my share of my estate." And the father actually goes and divides his estate between the two sons. Now, Bible commentators think that this particular son, the younger one, is probably in his late teens, early 20s. We learn from the passage that he's grown up in a home that has some sort of wealth, right? There are cattle, there are goats, and there's more than a few of them, right? They're able to throw a pretty wild party. There's a lot of land. We learn that here. There are servants. And so this is a family who has some means. And so when the son is asking the father for his share of his father's estate, like he's not asking for a few small coins. Like he's asking for a lot. And that would not have been the way it happened in that particular culture. And we can still identify with that today. Like even today, it's pretty rare that one of us will go to our parent and say, "Hey, it would be really great if you could divide up your stuff right now and give it to me, give me my share, because I just don't want to wait until you're dead." Like if you were that parent, what would you do? Like right? Yeah. Kind of like that right foot of justice, right? Like right in the pants, backside. And yet that's not what the father does. And in that particular culture, you would not ask for that, and as a father, you would not do that. And it would have been shocking to the audience that the dad actually responds by doing the unthinkable. He divides the property between his sons. In doing so, you know that he's going to take a significant financial loss, and yet he does. What happens next in verse 13 is maybe what we'd expect. So that younger son now, and we look at him and we say, he's so selfish, he's so self-absorbed. But he goes and he gets together all he has, and now he has a whole lot more than he did before. He has a part of his dad's wealth, and he sets off for a distant country, or in some translations, a far-off country. In other words, he gets as far away from his father as he can possibly get. And some of you came from environments where you said these words, "When I get out of this house, I am never coming back." And maybe like this is what you did, and that's where you still are in that way. That's what this guy did. But it didn't work out all that well for him. So he set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his father's wealth in wild living. Read it in the in the current language, the contemporary language. This younger son went to Vegas, okay? And he did all the things that people do in Vegas, except for he had nothing left at the end. He spent everything that he had, and at the end of it all, there was a severe famine that happened in the country, and he began to be in need. Now, some of you are hearing this, and you're thinking, this guy has it coming. Finally, justice, he gets what he deserves. If you're feeling that, you are probably able to identify more with the older brother in the story who kept all the rules and did exactly what he was supposed to do. Maybe that's where you see yourself. If you're feeling that, that's probably where you gravitate. If you're sitting here feeling like, oh man, like isn't there a chance for this poor younger son? Well, then maybe you're a little bit like the younger son. I don't know, only that's, I guess, between you and God. But anyway, so the son, younger one, gets so messed up and it gets so bad that he has to go out and hire himself out as a citizen of this country, and he gets hired to feed the pigs. Keep in mind that the story that Jesus is telling is very likely a story about a good, upstanding Jewish family, okay? They don't do pigs. And so it got really bad for the younger son. There's a lot going on in this son's life. It is a truly desperate situation. So desperate, too, that he is longing to fill his stomach with the things that the pigs are eating. He's in a very, very bad place. He's desperate. And yet he comes to his senses, right? And he decides that he's going to go and talk to his father. He wonders how many of his dad's hired servants who were hired just to do ordinary household tasks, how many of them actually have food, and there he is kind of starving and eating pig food. And so he decides to go back. He starts rehearsing the speech that he's going to give his father. He says, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And if you've ever been in a place like that, where you blew it, you failed miserably, like that, it's hard enough to fail, but it's like what if on the other side of it? Like what do I do with it? And you can imagine how difficult it is for him. Like, is he going to go back? And is he going to find a father kind of like with his arms crossed, just kind of like standing there saying, well, I told you so? Like a closed off posture? Or will he find a father who is kind of like open armed and waiting to welcome him in? We know how the story ends, but at this point in time, this younger son has no idea how the story is going to end. And yet for us, there's a surprising twist, isn't there? Because verse 20 says, but while he was still a long way off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. Notice that the father's been watching and waiting for the son to return. That the father is able to see the son while he's still a long way off. The father is able to see the son only because he's been watching all along. The father's not caught off guard that the son is coming back. He's been looking for him. That's the kind of love that he has for his son. And not only does he have this love for his son, and not only does he see him coming, because you could read that, if it would just share that detail, you could read the passage and think, oh, okay, he's for this. When the son finally comes, what he's supposed to do, then the father is going to show his love. But the father takes the initiative, right? He sees the son coming, and not only does he see, he responds. And he actually does something that would have been shocking to the original listeners, because in that day, like upstanding members of the community, like fathers, they wouldn't be caught like running in public in front of people. Like today, some of you guys, you like to run, right? And we see you around town, you're kind of doing your thing out there. They didn't do that then. This was not a thing. And so for the father to humble himself and even to humiliate himself in that way for the sake of his rebellious son, I think is profound. And it would have turned more than a few heads. It would have shocked every listener in the crowd that this is how this dad is responding to this messed up kid. And not only does he run toward his son, but even as he runs, he runs with a kind of like an open armedness, right? And he throws his arms around his son and he kisses him. He doesn't give that son a side hug, right? No side hugs. Some of you like side hugs, right? You don't like people touching you. I like side hugs. What? I'm awkward though. That's true. It is true. It's true. But there are some relationships, right? I'm not going to make you hug me. Michelle and I don't do side hugs, right? Because, calm down.
Obviously, we don't side hug.
Obviously. But there are some relationships that are so deep and so personal that a side hug would be insulting, right? That a side hug would send an altogether different message. And I love that Luke is careful to use this imagery here as he describes the story that Jesus is telling, that he throws his arms around his son. You can picture the force. Like, have you ever been hugged by that person? And it always happens to be these little old ladies, right? Where they hug you and you wonder where they have that upper body strength and where it comes from, because they do all but break your ribs as they pull you in. And I don't even like hugs that much. Those are some of the best hugs on earth, right? And I think of your mom, right? Betty Fairchild gave the best hugs. You could picture the father throwing his arms around his son like that and pulling him in. Just so glad that the son, who was once lost, has come home again. We learn a lot about the heart of the father here. We learn a lot about his compassion toward his son. But the son does not expect his father to do this. That there's something surprising about the father's reaction. But the son just sort of breaks in and just starts giving the speech that he's rehearsed along the way. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. And incidentally, it's not just what I did to you, Dad. It's what I did to God in the process. And I am completely repentant. I have no desire to live that way anymore. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Like I realize how far I've fallen. And yet the dad interrupts And he starts planning the welcome home party. It says, but the father said to his servants, it's almost like he said, shh. He tells the servants, quick. In other words, there was something urgent about this. Like, this is really important. Stop whatever you're doing and do this. Bring a robe, bring a ring, and bring sandals. You read that and you think, what does that mean? What does that have to do with anything? Well, in this particular culture, you would wear a robe or you would dress like the rest of your family dressed. Now, some of you are couples who like to dress alike, right? We know who you are because we see you. It was a little more than that in that particular culture, that when you wore your family's robe, it was saying that I belong to this group of people. My daughter right now is involved in some dance, and one of the major things that she wanted for Christmas this year was a jacket from her dance company because she wanted to feel like she belonged to the rest of the dance company. And so I think in various ways we can identify with what would have been happening in this particular culture, that he pulls out the best robe so that this son can be welcomed back in and look like the rest of them. Oh, by the way, this son probably has not showered and cleaned up on his way home. That the son probably reeks. He's probably dirty, and yet he's walking back in and he's starting to now look like he's one of the family. He gets a ring on his finger. In those days, rings were used a lot for transacting business. And so it seems to me and to a lot of other Bible commentators that when he gets the ring put on his finger, the father is actually reinstating him as a full financial partner in the family. Now, you can start to see why the older son is going to be so ticked off, right? Because whose money is the younger son who squandered away going to get now? He's going to get some of the older brother's money too. Less for him. And then he asks for sandals to be put on his son's feet. Because in that culture, the only people who were known to be barefoot would be your servants, your farm hands, all those people. They would be barefoot. But this son is being expressed to him that he is now a free man, that his choices have not put him out of reach of the Father's love, that he's able to experience all that the Father offers now that he's come back home. And so the Father orders that the fattened calf would be killed. And there's a feast and there's partying, there's celebration. And here's why. He says, for the son of mine is alive again. He was lost and is found. And so they began to celebrate. You have a beautiful picture of the Father's love. A love that never quits, a love that's marked with compassion, a love that's overwhelming. It's a picture of God's love for us, and as Jesus expresses it. But the story's not done. Because verse 25 says, meanwhile, ... the older son is in the field. And what's the older son doing out there? The older son is working. The older son is doing what he's supposed to do. The older son is following all the rules. And when he comes near the house, what does he hear? He hears the music and all the dancing and the fun that's happening. And he calls one of the servants and he says, hey, what's going on in there? And they say, hey, your brother has come. And your father has killed the fattened calf, and he's happy because your younger brother is home safe and sound. And you would think that the older brother would be happy that his younger brother is back home again. You'd think he'd be happy that he could eat some free steak. Who doesn't like free steak? Some of you don't, but most of us, right, are like, that sounds really good. Who wouldn't want that? But he's ticked majorly, and he's so angry that he refuses to go in, and his dad begs him to come into the party. And it's almost as if the dad is now out there with the older son, pleading for him to come in and experience the awesomeness of all that's going on inside. And really the awesomeness of all that would be happening within that family. The father pleading with the older son now says, look, all these years the son pleads with the father and says, look, all these years I've been slaving away for you and disobeyed your orders, yet you never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. Now, most of us were never asking our parents for a young goat, right? So we could celebrate with our friends. You fill in the blank with whatever it was that you would have wanted to have with your friends whenever it was when you were living your glory days, right? But he says, but the son of yours, notice he says this son of yours, he doesn't even want to identify his brother as his brother. When he squandered away your property with prostitutes, when he comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. And even if you don't agree, friends, he has a point. Like, it's just not fair. That this younger guy doesn't deserve the father's welcome. But the older brother reveals what's really going on in his heart. Instead of obeying his father in love, he's been following the rules and slaving away to get actually what he wanted. Sure, he's obedient. Yes, he is loyal. He's absolutely hardworking. And yet at the same time, he's revealing here he's unloving, he's ungracious, he's bitter, and he's prideful. And he's just as lost as the younger brother. He's just as lost as the rebellious brother because he doesn't respond appropriately to the heart of his father either. And then the father pleads with his son and says, my son. He reinforces the relationship there and says, you are always with me and everything that I have is yours. But today we celebrate and we're glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. There's lots of things I love about the story, but there's one thing that I cannot stand about this story. And it's that Jesus doesn't give a resolution to how it ends. We don't know if the self-righteous rule follower goes into the welcome party and experiences all the awesomeness that family provides. We don't know if he stays outside and heads in the opposite direction himself. I like stories that you know what happens at the end. And in a series I watch on TV, I like when all the loose ends are finally tied up. Cannot stand when you're left hanging. Just tell us. But I wonder if what Jesus is doing here is not turning it back to us then. People who can identify with the people in the story or faces in the crowd. And almost saying to us, what will you do with this? How will the story end with you as you see yourself in it? What will you do with the love the Father longs to give you? Because again, Jesus in this passage demonstrates the heart of the everlasting Father. And so very quickly, I want to take us through just 3 very simple points of application that we can make to our own lives. Points that we can apply to our relationship with God, points that apply to how we see ourselves, how we see the people around us, how we see our fellow followers of Jesus, and even how we see the world around us who has yet to put their hope in Jesus. Here's the first sort of like unimaginable reality that's revealed about Jesus as our everlasting Father, that we are more loved than we could ever imagine, that there is a lot of symbolism here in the passage that shows us a little bit about how God interacts with us and how Jesus reveals it to us. That both of these sons, the rule follower and the rebel, both missed the heart of the Father. Both were alienated from the Father. Both wanted what the Father was going to give, but both did not want the Father himself. One was a reckless rebel. The other was that self-righteous rule follower. The rule follower was not so good that he could earn his way into the Father's love. We see that. But the rebel of a son was not so bad that he would miss out on the Father's love. The Father's heart was for both. The Father loved them both. The Father pleaded with them both. The imagery of the Father's heart and his love toward the younger son is seen in his physical posture, right, of him opening his arms and bringing him in. You think about that open armedness, and you think about the cross, right? You think about Jesus and how he gave his life so that anyone who calls on his name, anyone who puts their hope in Jesus so they can be saved and welcomed into God's forever family. But we also see the Father's posture toward his rule-following son in how he was pleading with him to come in through his words. And so it was his words and his actions both together where we see his heart revealed and reminds us that we are more loved than we can ever imagine. What we celebrate at Christmas time is the fact that God loved us so much that he actually took those steps to come to us. He entered time and space, lived a life we could never measure up to, and he would send his son Jesus to die the death we all deserve to prove that we are that loved by him. But what we also see here is that we're more forgiven than we could ever imagine. That when we respond to the heart of the Father, when we respond to the divine initiative of the Father, the way that the Father has taken steps toward us and has come to us with arms wide open, when we respond, we're more forgiven than we could ever imagine because the Father is willing to welcome in the rule-following Father's heart and the rebellious son who missed the Father's heart. That one had a messed up lifestyle and the other one had a messed up heart, but nothing was too big or too bad for God to forgive. That for us, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. That God's heart is for those of you who are here and can identify with just failure and having blown it and having missed the mark. Some of your stories, for those of you who put your hope in Jesus, your story is that you were heading in the absolute opposite direction, that your life had fallen apart. You got into this thing or that thing, and yet in some sort of supernatural way, God drew you to himself. You had your eyes opened up to the good news of the gospel, and you responded to that divine initiative. Others of you, your story is like this. If you put your hope in Jesus, that you grew up in a religious environment, or you grew up in a very moral environment, and yet you had to come to the place where you put your hope in Jesus yourself, that you responded to that divine initiative, where you responded to the Father's love and turned from anything you could possibly do to earn his favor. But when we come to see and know the Father's love, we experience that forgiveness that only the Father can provide. We're more forgiven than we can ever imagine, which actually helps us, I think, to not just understand God's heart toward us, but God's heart toward other people. I love how in the passage, the son, the older son, as he's angry at his dad, is kind of like just kind of going off toward his dad and says, "This son of yours," and the father, as he pleads with him, says, "This brother of yours." That for those of us who put our hope in Jesus, we are made brothers and sisters with our fellow followers of Jesus in the truest sense. That there is a depth of relationship there that we're reminded of as well, that we are able to demonstrate the heart of the Father even toward one another. But I think what's also compelling in the passage is that we see the Father's desire to have a relationship with his sons. The religious rule follower and the reckless rebel. Father wants to welcome them both. The Father has a heart for both. Yes, it's true. Religion or rule following and irreligion and being a rebel, both of those leave us outside of a relationship with God. That's the nature of our sin and our brokenness. Yet God desires a relationship with us. He shows us this in this passage. He shows us this in the birth of his son, Jesus. He shows us his desire for a relationship as Jesus would go to the cross, as Jesus would rise again from the dead. We see it in the good news of the gospel. And when we come back to the Father, we're welcomed into this party. That he doesn't welcome us back with anger or bitterness, that he welcomes us back with love, compassion, and grace. And it's only by God's grace that we can be welcomed in the first place. So the passage pushes us toward the gospel. It pushes us toward Jesus, that this story can be our story. And so let me say first that if you're here today and maybe you feel like the places you've been, the things you've done have somehow put you out of reach of God's grace and God's love, that God wouldn't want someone as broken or dirty or messed up as you, I think this passage proves that the Father's heart, the everlasting Father's heart, is one who has a heart for those irreligious rebels. Maybe you're here today and you think that somehow all the good things that you've done in your life and all the ways you've done what God has wanted have in some way earned you a right to be kind of around that family table and be welcomed into this party. But this passage says that it doesn't work that way either. That all of us need to put our hope in Jesus. And maybe you're here and you've never put your hope in Jesus and trusted him alone. Like this is the way kind of into a life that is meaningful and purposeful. This is the way into a life as it was meant to be lived. And so if that's you today, that's your very first step. But what about for those of us who have put our hope in Jesus? What do we do with a passage like this? Well, it's clear. Jesus is our everlasting Father. He's the Father we've always been looking for or longing for. He's the Father that we've always craved. And as we're welcomed back home, when we start to realize that Jesus is that everlasting Father, we actually start to heal from some of those wounds that might be left on us by our earthly fathers. And this is where it gets really personal for us. Because while we may have had earthly fathers who were distant, or who quit, or who died prematurely, uninvolved, uncaring, abusive, or what have you. It's only when we come to experience the love of our everlasting Father that we can finally be able to start to heal from some of that deep woundedness, that personal woundedness that comes from our earthly Father. And maybe you're here today and you're kind of struggling in one way or another, and I would encourage you to take one of those steps that's there that describes just engaging a little more with this everlasting Father so that you can begin to deal with some of those father wounds. One of the best things that I ever did, one of the best things that I ever did was sought out some biblical wisdom of people who know a little bit more than I do about this sort of thing to help me to process some of those things. And for some of you, the relationship with your father, you might think it's too late because my father's gone, or it's just never going to be. And while that may be true, God can do a tremendous work in our hearts when we start to understand the everlasting Father ourselves. And so I would encourage you, if that's you, to take some of those steps. There are some other steps that we can take too. Sometimes we struggle with how we see ourselves. Sometimes we see ourselves perhaps as more broken than we are. Maybe even as a follower of Jesus, we still just think of like all those many things that we've done, and maybe we think of ourselves as less than. When the Father's love, as we come to him and put our hope in Jesus, he fully reinstates us as sons and daughters. He brings us in and we get all the benefits of that welcome party. And there's a way maybe that you need to see yourself a little differently. Maybe though you see yourself maybe as a little too good. Maybe because you see yourself as too good, you are having a hard time having a hard time welcoming in people who maybe are different than you. And so you can see how there's many different applications to the passage. The big one is where do we stand with the Father's love? And if we've responded to it, then how can we bring it to life in these various ways? This is a very personal passage. And I don't presume to know exactly how God wants to apply it to your particular life and your particular struggles. But what I know is this: the Father's love is real. The Father's love is powerful. He is just as loving and gracious and merciful and compassionate as he's ever been. And we can enjoy that relationship with him day in and day out. Let's pray.